The next deadly pandemic is just a forest clearing away, but we're not even trying to prevent it. And we have actively done nothing to stop the ignition of a future outbreak. Now, generations ago, families fleeing the tribal violence in southern Guinea settled in the lush, humid forest. They took solace among the trees, which offered cover from intruders and carved a life out of the land. Their descendants call it Milandau, which elders there says comes from the words in the Kissi language, meaning "this is as far as we will go." Um, by 2013, a village had bloomed where trees once stood. 31 homes surrounded by a ring of forest and footpaths that led to pocket residents, and it had cleared to plant rice. Their children played in a hollowed-out tree that was home to a large colony of bats. Nobody knows exactly how it happened, but a virus that once lived inside a bat found its way into the cells of a toddler named Emil. I'm not sure if I'm going to say the last name right, but the kid's name was Emil Aumano, and it happened to be the Ebola virus, which invaded on multiple fronts: the immune system, the liver, the lining of the vessels that keep blood from leaking into the body, and Emil ran a high fever and pastille blackened with which means his shit blackened with blood as his body tried to defend against the attack. A few days later, Emil was dead. Now, on average, only half of those infected by Ebola survived the rest of the medical shock and organ failure. The virus took Emil's 4-year-old sister and their mother, who perished after delivering a stillborn child. Emil's grandmother, feverish and vomiting, clung to the back of a motorbike taxi as it hurled out of the forest toward a hospital in the nearest city, which was I'm not sure if I'm going to say this one right either, but the city was called Gekadu. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. A market hub drawing traders from neighboring countries. She died as the virus began its spread. Now, Emil was known as Patient Zero in the worst Ebola outbreak the world has ever seen. Now, the virus infiltrated 10 countries, and it infected 28,600 people, and it killed more than 11,300. The healthcare workers were clad head to toe in protective gear, and they rushed to West Africa to treat the sick and they extinguished the epidemic. An effort that took more than 2 years and cost at least it cost us $3.6 billion. Then the foreign doctors packed up and the medical tents came down. This has long been the way the world deals with with the viral threats, basically. The institutions we trust to protect us from the World Health Organization to U.S. agencies like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they focus on responding to epidemics, fighting the fires once they have begun, as if we could not have predicted where they would start to prevent them sparking, basically. Now, but looking back, researchers now see that the dangerous conditions were brewing before the virus leaked from animals to humans in Milandau, which is an event scientists call spillover. Now, the way the villagers cut down trees in patches that look like Swiss cheese from above, and it created edges of disturbed forests where humans and infected animals could collide. Rats and bats, with their histories of seeding and plagues, are the species most likely to adapt to deforestation. And researchers found that some bats are stressed out by habitat loss after later shed more of the virus. Now, researchers have considered more than 100 variables that could contribute to an Ebola outbreak, and found that the ones that began in Milandau and 6 other locations in Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo were best explained by forest loss in the 2 years leading up to these first cases. It is now clear that these landscapes were tinderboxes for the spillover of a deadly virus. Now, we wondered what the world had done to keep disaster from striking again. Had global health leaders channeled money into stopping tree loss or deployed experts to help communities learn how to sustain themselves without cutting down the forests? To get a sense of the current risk of spillover from deforestation at these sites, ProPublica consulted with a dozen researchers for its own analysis, which was unprecedented in its quest for specific real-world findings. Using a rhetorical model developed by a team of biologists, ecologists, and mathematicians, we applied data on tree loss from historical satellite images that were taken between the years of 2000 and 2021, and the most recent being available, and tested tens of thousands of infection scenarios. The results are alarming, and basically it found that the same dangerous pattern of deforestation has increased around Milandau in the past decade, putting the residents at a greater risk of an Ebola spillover than they faced in 2013, when the disease first ravaged their village. Now, they also the scientists ran the model for 5 other epicenters of previous Ebola outbreaks in Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and 4 of these locations, that telltale pattern of tree loss got worse in the years since those outbreaks, raising their chances of facing the deadly virus again. It's very powerful, said Rania Plowray, who's a professor at disease ecology at Cornell University, and she's the senior author of the model who reviewed ProPublica's findings. Even though we know the fundamental drive of these outbreaks, we have effectively done nothing to stop the ignition of a future outbreak. Now, ProPublica had traveled to Milandau, where on the ground a stark picture emerged. It's not just that the same conditions remain that primed Milandau to kindle the worst Ebola outbreak in history. We found that they're only going to get worse. It takes a half an hour to walk from the homes of Milandau through the forest to the mountainside, where each family is assigned a plot of land to farm. Now the village life gives way to the hum of insects as residents trek up the dirt path, some balancing basins of water on their heads, and not even the children are exempt from the work it takes to clear the ground for planting. It goes on from dawn to dusk every day, but Sunday, heedless of the heat. You know you're close to the farms when you start to hear the sound of metal striking the earth. And one day last summer, a 7-year-old boy beat a piece of scrap metal between two rocks, forming it into the head of a toe, and then he raced up the slope to join other young workers. Jiba Masanduano, the village chief, followed them, sprinkling rice seed where the land was freshly bare. And these are not the terraced rice paddies that rise like stars of giants and postcards from Asia, but farming here is very time-consuming and difficult, and with steep slopes prone to erosion, many farmers in the U.S. Use controlled irrigation, mechanization, fertilizers, and products to kill pest and disease. In Milandau, everything is done by hand, and farmers are at the mercy of the weather and depleted soils with no room for any error. If a field produces a decent harvest one year, they'll plant it again the next. If it doesn't, the farmers cut down or burn another patch of the forest. And the majority of emerging infectious diseases originally come from wildlife. Many might picture places with caged animals as the spots most primed for a novel virus to spread to humans. But after all, one of the most leading theories about the origin of COVID-19 is that the virus jumped to humans at a market that sold wild animals in Wuhan. And health authorities now are worried about the pandemic potential for bird flu that swept through a mink farm in Spain last year. But scientists have shown that land use change, especially clearing forests or agriculture, is the biggest driver of spillover.
That's one of my favorites.
In Borneo, the deforestation has brought I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, brought macaques closer to humans. Now, researchers believe that seeding outbreaks of what's known as monkey malaria. In Australia, the clearing of eucalyptus trees pushed bats closer to home and farms, spurring the spread of the brain-inflaming Hendra virus. In Nepal, Nipah, which is Nipah. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Another virus that causes the brain to swell had killed more than 100 people in Malaysia in the late 1990s. After slash and burn, agriculture forced bats closer to hog farms, and the virus jumped first to pigs and then to humans. That horrific outbreak was fictionalized in the movie Contagion. Researchers have also found that it's not just the amount of forests cut down by the pattern of deforestation that matters, but models have shown that the more patchy a forest gets, the more edges are created at the borders of clearing where the virus-carrying animals can come into contact with humans, until so much forest is cut down that it can't sustain wildlife anymore. The theoretical model we worked with encapsulates this concept to assess a risk by considering the amount of edge that's produced by deforestation. Cutting one big chunk out of a forest would create less edge than cutting out many holes. The chance of spillover is higher where people and animals had overlap which the model assumes is along the edge of cleared forest patches, and we estimated the size of these mixing zones within a radius of 20 kilometers, or about 12.5 miles from Mialandu. Experts told us this was a reasonable distance for a person there to cover foot or bicycle. We found that that as the forests around Mialandu got more fragmented, the mixing zone area increased sharply by 61% from 2013, and the year the epidemic began in 2021. Now, while the model does not calculate the absolute risk of spillover, factors like population density and human behavior are not considered, but it shows that the potential for an outbreak starting has increased due to growing patchiness of the surrounding forest. Now, last summer, the mountainsides around Mialandu were dotted with the light green rice shoots punctuated by tree stumps. The elders there reminisced about the lush forest that they grew up in. They hated to see it shrinking, but they said the trees were a necessary sacrifice. The 2021 harvest was meager, so the village did not have any money for rice sales to buy fertilizer or pesticide for the crop planted in 2022. Now, fearful of a famine, they cleared more of the forest for farming and stuff like that. So some families also supplement their income by chopping down even more trees to make charcoal that they can sell. And despite the billions spent on recovery from the outbreak that began here, no one has helped the farmers adopt any more methods that could lessen their risk of a spillover. Now, ProPublica shared with rice farming experts photos of the Melandale villagers at work and asked what could be done to help them grow food without constantly clearing any more of the forest. Um, Mamadou Belobiri, a retired researcher with the Agronomic Research Institute of Guinea, said that those subsistence methods yield only about 1 metric ton of rice per hectare. In neighboring Mali, where the environment is kindred to rice growers, the average yields are 4 to 6 metric tons per hectare, with potential for 10. And what's more, 75% to 80% of the cultivated land in Africa is degraded. And Melandau, the fragile soil can lose essential nutrients and organic matter after a year or two of planting. Now, experts have said that one way to improve the soil's fertility is to plant cover crops which add nitrogen to the soil and are left to decay in the fields and slow soil erosion. Erica Steiger, a professor of tropical agronomy at Cornell University, said the villagers could divide the fields into sections and rotate what's planted each year. Rice 1 year, cassava the next, and then let that section rest with cover crops for several years. And this, along with targeted fertilizer application, could increase the organic matter in the soil and gradually triple or quadruple their yields compared with what they're harvested now. The bigger expense would be to support an agriculture specialist to build trust with the farmers and figure out what works best so they can avoid clearing more of the forest. A program in Madagascar, which set out not to prevent spillover but to save trees, has succeeded in doing this. Now, the world has produced more than 40 reports on what went wrong during the epidemic that began in Melandau and how to avoid any similar disasters in the future. And yet Barry, the Guinean farming expert, said the authors of those reports had never asked him or his colleagues for any advice. But the link between farming and health is always on the mind of Masanduno, the village chief, whose brow seems permanently furrowed in an expression of concern. As he strides up and down the slope, flinging handfuls of rice seed, he is aware that any excess crop can be sold to pay for medications, but he remembers neighbors who have died in recent years of appendicitis and hernias, and during childbirth unable to afford going on to the hospital because the harvest was too bare. He knows that villagers, especially children, catch rodents in the forest to kill their bellies, despite the fact that rats in Guinea can carry Lassa fever, which can cause deafness and death. And we are suffering, and the government has forgotten us, the international community has forgotten us, and the failure to imagine ways to prevent spillover is rooted in who gets a chance to weigh in when it's time to make policies and spend money to protect the world from the next big one. But after the Ebola epidemic, Suri Moon, who's a co-director of the Global Health Center at the Geneva Graduate Institute, had helped lead one of the more influential studies of what needed to change to avoid another epidemic. Back in 2015, a report focused on preparing for and responding to any outbreaks, and she said because that was the expertise of the people in the room, including many policy wonks fluent in critical and global crisis, infectious disease epidemiologists, and a representative from the Doctors Without Borders, the nonprofit that sent medical workers to the epicenter of the outbreak, experts in agriculture, conservation and ecology, and those most attuned to the forces that drive spillover. They were not present, and they were largely excluded from conversations about how to spend the pandemic prevention money. Now, though the research tying the deforestation to outbreaks has piled up since then the mindset hasn't changed. The Biden administration's pandemic preparedness plan, published back in September 2021 after COVID-19 had ripped across the globe, identified 5 areas for action, all of which focused on responding to an outbreak that had already begun. The International Health Organization has already begun, and the international health regulations established by the WHO to govern how the U.S. and the nearly 200 other countries addressed infectious threats are largely built on the assumption that disease outbreaks cannot be prevented, only contained and extinguished. Now, Moon and her co-authors wrote in an article calling for more investment and prevention. The U.S. has invested in preventing spillover, but its most notable projects haven't already attempted to stop the kind of deforestation that can lead to outbreaks. Now, the bad thing is that if you're ever in like the Republic of Congo, and it says so for the town of Gekadu, now if an ambulance was going to pick up a person, they claimed that the ambulance can take up to an hour to arrive, which is slowed by the jolting of a dirt road. and sometimes it doesn't come at all. And the only option is to take the patient themselves, calling a motorbike taxi to carry the patient into town, potentially setting up the same chain of transmission that allowed Ebola to tumble unannounced into the more populous areas of the country. One thing in Milandu has changed. The hollowed out tree is gone, set ablaze by the community. Its decayed stump has been swallowed by the forest, but the bats remain. Hundreds of them return to Milandu every fall after the rainy season, and they found a new tree. This one even closer to the residents' homes, and it towers by the entrance to the village, a few paces off the dirt path just opposite the sign that promises that after Ebola everything got better, which it didn't. Um, yeah, so. But if you like the video, you can get the video, like, and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also hit the notification bell. So that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. Leave a comment, let me know what you think. And if you want to support my work and my brother, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of YouTube. And for just as little as a few bucks a month, your donation can help go a long way. And thanks for listening.